future. But never fear, we have the settings set so that it is only recording those of us who are unmuted and talking. So you can have your camera on and you will not be recorded for posterity. Please do use the chat throughout the evening if you have any questions for our authors. Post your questions in the chat and we will save them up, and Davith and I will pose those questions for you at the end of the night. And then last of all, before we get started, a note of thanks to all of you. It is trying times for an independent bookstore still, but we're still here. Both Northshire locations are still getting through, and that is really thanks to the continued loyal ongoing support of our customers. So that's you, and we couldn't do it without you. So thank you so very, very much for being here tonight and for your support. And without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Davith to introduce our author.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I've really been looking forward to tonight's event for months. I think it's going to be really special. We're joined today by two authors who are both poets, translators, and biographers. Peter Filkins is the Richard B. Fisher Professor of Literature and Creative Writing at Bard College at Simon's Rock and a visiting professor of literature at Bard College. He's written 5 volumes of poetry that have been praised by, among others, the late Richard Wilbur, J. Perini, James Lasden, and others. A recipient of a Berlin Prize Fellowship from the American Academy in Berlin, he has translated extensively from both Ingeborg Bachmann and H.G. Adler. In 2019, he published his biography, H.G. Adler, A Life in Many Worlds. And just this month was released his latest book of poetry, Water Music. We are joined also by Rosanna Warren. She is a Hannah Holborn Gray Distinguished Service Professor in the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. It's a mouthful of the title. The daughter of Robert Penn Warren and Eleanor Clark, her poetry has been praised by a who's who of American poets and writers. Richard Eberhart, Mark Strand, Harold Bloom, Anthony Hecht, and Jane Hirschfield will be a guest for ours in the event later on this month. She's been awarded numerous prizes, including the Sarah Teasdale Prize for Poetry, 3 Pushcart Prizes, awards from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Academy of American Poets, and the Guggenheim Foundation. Last year, her most recent volume of poetry, So Forth, was published. And also last year was published her widely acclaimed biography of the French modernist poet Max Jacob, A Life in Arts and Letters. Please join me in welcoming to Northshire, Peter Filkins and Rosanna Warren. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. It's very nice to be here, and I'm so pleased to be reading with Rosanna, a longtime friend and a writer and poet who I deeply admire and whose wonderful book, So Forth, was published in the past year, and it's just one of the great books of the last 12 months or so. I'm very happy to be reading here at Northshire Bookstore. It's a place of pilgrimage for me. I live in Western Massachusetts in the Berkshires, so I'm very familiar with the Manchester store, and I've also visited the one in Saratoga. And independent bookstores are our lifeblood, and thank you for being here, and thank you for having both of us. I'm going to read poems from Water Music, just to hold it up and show you that actually behind me is Michael Zelahowski's very lovely work of art, which he kindly loaned to us to appear on the cover. And the title of the book is Water Music. It has a slash in between the 2 words, because I think in this book, I'm trying to explore the border between culture and nature. And when we talk of culture, of course, we talk about history. And when we talk of history, we talk of pain. It is, unfortunately, the predominant force of history, I guess. And I'm going to read poems. I'm doing a number of different readings from the book. So I'm going to read a different set of poems for this read. I'm trying to vary the readings as we go. And I'm teaching a course on Rilke at Bard, Annandale right now, and was reading a letter of Rilke's this afternoon in which he says, "It is not our task to dissolve pain in our consciousness. It does not tolerate being interpreted. Pain is reasonable only on the side where it faces nature. On the other side, it is absurd, raw material, unhewn, without form and surface, ungraspable." And I guess that's the thread I'm going to try to explore briefly in the poems, because it is a thread that runs through the book, sort of the pain and duress of history but also posing it in the face of nature and how nature allows us a place to abide in the face of suffering. I'll begin with a poem that's simply, it's called In Vivo. It's the first poem in the book. And in vivo means to exist or to be performed in the living body. In vivo. Suffering knows what cannot heal the self embedded in the pain of pain, and so continues unrestrained, lancing the mind that won't let go, the bloodied self, alone, sustained by sharper knowledge, suffering knows. And then I'm going to read from the second section of the book, which is a series of 10 poems that really I think of as a kind of journey through duress and a year of duress. And I'm just going to read these poems one after another. They don't really need setting up. I'll just simply read the titles. Obad. The seagull kiting in a cage of wind navigates again its scry of need. Beyond the docks, the wooden boats, rough barbs, buoying flight toward an end to flight, and gravity riding the wind. Little problem. Longing, we say, and by extension imply duration we cannot stay. Caught as we are somewhere between the all apparent and what we've seen of storms, of harbors, the wind-chopped bay, laced with whitecaps like macrame, slow to unravel and tattered seam, knotted with longing, we cannot stay. It's a poem called Ashore, and it has 3 sections, with each which has a subtitle. So I'll just read the subtitles as I go. Ashore. Map. Where are we going? It isn't clear, since where we are is already here. Aware the far shore is a bit more near than first expected or was made clear, by starlight guiding the course we steer, blithely upon the cusp of fear, of never knowing that it's clear where we are going is already here. Survey. How deep is the lake? As deep as it gets. Who dammed the river? Nobody yet. Which way runs the current, both east and west? Can you swim in it? Try your best. Has anyone ever drowned? A few, not all. Are there any fish in it, large and small? What is its name? Kettle in Mohegan. How long has it been here? A day and an eon. Does it ever freeze over? Absent the sun. How long have you lived here? The water flows on. Census. Fishermen on the lake make no mistake and cast their line ashore. Fishermen on the shore want something more and strike the hidden middle. The wide water waits, mysterious and calm, its depths built for drowning, its surface always level. Willow. Amid the toss of light that rakes the rust of oak, pearl gray cloud cover, bellying rain, the willow lingers, pliant with weeping that is not there, and yet is what we know it by, among hemlock, among ash, beside the lake water that laps the rocky shore, as a heron unfolds its pageant slate above the surface, rippling bruise. Rain. Falling and falling cannot be a curse of becoming the blight of day. Aqueous, free to trample hay cut for winter or left to rot. Fields, ferns, fog-bound weather, perpetual as air or an Ararat. Solstice. That on this day of winter dark, rain impelling the ribbed coppery flash of oak leaves, the year should end and compel the mind toward the gravity of pines, tremulous with wind, hail, blast, and a moment marked as the sun draws farthest away from the earth and seems to pause before returning. Nadir. Out of the air embodied settles as flurries down laden streets, soft declamations of silence unhurried, earthward their journey, emptied of wind, lake ice contracting its vice of cold, murmured music on which we skate. Narcissi. Forced in February, six-petaled stars crown these airy, tall columnar stems, inclining their heavy heads, weary, pining for a death attended, not by the tremor of papery husks, but starlit verdure at winter's dusk. Credo. Never complain, the jonquils say, blousy with breeze they cannot hold, and the breeze itself, saturated, cold, dispenses torrents, a black cloud drained to quick exhaustion, and the marauded plain of jonquils blazoned, never complain. And finally, nocturne. Suffice it to say, the full moon's hard light exposing the ambush of sea, invading the harbor, cannot know the concerted blast that cripples an elm to a stack of limbs. Suffice it to say, and say it to praise the burnished horizon, its collar of rust, suppliant above the sea's reckless glitter, these meager stars piercing the scrim of moonlight proffered, its silver, its peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for those lovely poems, and congratulations to this very lovely book. And my thanks also to David and Rachel and the civilized hospitality of the Northshire Bookstore. I'm going to be reading a few poems from this new book, so forth. Let's look at the time, 6:14. Okay. There are poems in here that I regard as sort of, the fables are personal, and there are other poems, some of which were composed within the last 4 or 5 years, that are more obviously political, civic in their concerns. Well, here's one of the political civic ones. It's called Samson 1674, and it's dedicated to John Milton. And so Samson Agonistes, his late ferocious play is in, well, verse play is in mind. And the Trump regime is in mind, and I hope you see it in the poem. Samson 1674 for John Milton. Their theaters cackle and bray. Their carriages clutter the streets. Cockades, torches, liveries clash. Philistine hearts, jocund and sublime, they smear their deals gold on columns and cornices. Temples fume with burning fat. The choicest girls parade with kohl-ringed eyes and spangled thighs. Let the poor creep into shadows. They offend. The prisons teem. And one old man sits in his doorway in a loose gray coat, letting sunlight lay its palms on his sightless eyes. He's seen too much. Kingdoms askew, skies collapsing, idols crammed back into shrines. Let the mad cavalcade pass by. There's a kind of defeat that resembles victory. There's a temple raised up only in the mind, and another to be pulled down in dream, arms wrapped around massive pillars to tug and shatter the roof on guzzling lords, not by his arms, not by his gouty hands, but the phoenix spark sleeps in ash. And for a poem of a very different tone, here I got fascinated a few years ago by the pre-Socratic philosophers, and this one is a tribute to Anaximander, but you don't really have to know about Anaximander to, I hope, feel for the poem. And you will also see here, I suppose, a sense of the fragility of our world right now, and the fragility of an individual life. So the poem is addressed to a one beloved person who is ill, but it also sees worlds, plural. That the earth is suspended. As Scylla prinks purple from half-thawed clods, and the cardinal flings his ribbon of song in two high arcs, then trails the vibrato among the boughs, May unclenches, but not enough. Buds grip fetal leaves. Each night scatters frost. On sidewalks, we tread on broken sky. You are sick and far away. The world is in flux, said Anaximander. Worlds are born, appear, and disappear. We perish. Even the gods fade. Spare me the industrial daffodils poking through scraps of snow. The season will have its hard birth, and we will be dragged into light. For how many years has that ill corroded your gut? Whirlwinds, typhoons break out of the cloud. The tearing makes thunder. The crack against black makes the flash. So natural philosophy began. You watched glaciers slide and crash at the tip of the earth. You floated on a rope into ice crevasses to catch the gleam and the groan. Ice sculpted the planet and sculpts it still. You hammered aluminum into that shape. The stars are a wheel of fire, broken off from earth fire, surrounded by air. We came from the unlimited. To it we return. So taught Anaximander of Miletus, who thought we would be destroyed. Let's see. And I think I might just read one more to leave time for us to talk about biography. This is a Vermont poem. It is addressed to my daughter, Chiara, who is a psychiatric social worker and works with very, very afflicted people. For Chiara, leaves crackle beneath our feet, tinder, kindling, as we walk by the brook, the crabapple tree, a crimson pointy east nimbus. You want to hold each wounded soul in your hands. Autumn flares. The damaged, the human berserk find their way to you. I don't know how you sleep. In the Gorgon's blood, one drop is poison, the other heals. Fevered autumn, autumn I adore, croons an old song. We stroll the road, scuffing dust, and come upon a garter snake lying motionless. Its tail, we guess, nicked by a passing car. When we nudge it, it flips to its back in an agonized S, squirms, but can't advance. Its belly gleams. we edge it into the grass. Do we stop seeing when we walk away? The brook prattles on, homes far off. Dusk settles slowly among leaves. That's not mercy scattering from its hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosanna. Those are lovely poems. I know them well. And as billed, we were going to talk about biography. So please tell us about your wonderful book on Max Jacob.
Oh, thank you, Peter. And I'm keeping an eye on the time so we don't run over. This is the cover of the book. Max, as I come to think of him, I started when I was, you might say, practically a kid. I did other books along the way and raised some children and taught some classes. But anyway, 35 years is a long time to work on a book. I became obsessed with Max Jacob when I was still in college and spending a summer in Paris in the great library, the Bibliothèque Jacques Doucet. And in the notes, in Derain's studio notes, I found letters to and from Max Jacob because Derain had illustrated one of Jacob's early books. So Jacob briefly is a man of contradictions. He was a Jew. He was born a Jew in the provincial town of Quimper in Brittany, but he became an ardent, ecstatic, mystical Catholic as a result of a vision of Christ he had in 1909, and he was converted formally in 1915 with Picasso as his godfather. He was a provincial, but very much involved in the center of creating modernism in Paris. He was poor. His family, he was born to a non-observant Jewish family in Quimper. They were pretty much the only Jews there. There was no religious life in the family, and they were shopkeepers. They weren't indigent. That there was a modest living. And Jacob, as a bohemian artist, painter, and poet and novelist, was always poor. But he had friends who were princes and counts and countesses, the whole whirl of the beau monde, the tout Paris. He was good friends with Coco Chanel. He was good friends with the great courtesan Liane de Pougy, who married a Romanian prince and became La Princesse Ghica. So this is poverty, bohemian poverty, but also sort of a kind of luxury. He was a painter. He made his living more by selling his modest, sweet, charming little gouache paintings. No pretension to be a great master painter. And he was a writer. He was a revolutionary writer. We know him because he reinvented the prose poem with his radical book of prose poems published in 1917 called Le Cornet à dés, the dice cup. But he also wrote marvelous lyrical poems and very experimental novels. Saul Bellow, whom I knew well, used to praise Jacob's little experimental fictions to me, to the skies. He's a fascinating writer. And he was the first French person who became interested in Picasso in 1901 when Picasso was 19 and had his first show in the Vollard Gallery, first trip to Paris. It was little Max Jacob, who was 10 years older, who saw these brilliant paintings and said, who is this person? And they became, you might say, art brothers, blood brothers. And for a while, when Picasso came back to Paris in 1903 and was totally penniless, Jacob, who was also very, very poor and worked odd jobs, invited Picasso to come stay in share his room, and Jacob supported them with his little jobs and pittance for some crucial weeks in Picasso's life, which Picasso never forgot. So when Picasso came back in 1904 and established himself up in Montmartre at the Bateau Lavoir and began inventing what we know as Cubism, Jacob was in the studio every single day, reinventing what we know as modern poetry. And it was Jacob who, the first nucleus of modernism in Paris was Jacob and Picasso together, and they were joined then by Apollinaire, who was still writing symbolist poems. And it was Jacob who said to Guillaume Apollinaire, well, look out the window, there are cars, there's the Eiffel Tower, there are newspapers, oh, wake up, stop writing about fairies and elves. Um, and, um, and so then Pierre Reverdy sort of became inspired by them, and Braque and the André Derain and Juan Gris, and Cubist painting was born, and a kind of radical poetics out of what Jacob and his friends started doing. Jacob was also ardently homosexual, and when had his ecstatic conversion to Catholicism, he suffered agonies of guilt for his sexual proclivities, and he was very promiscuous, though increasingly he had a tendency to fall in love with really impossible and very destructive people. He spent 14 years of his life as a lay associate of the Benedictine monastery in Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire, which is about a couple hours. It's near Orléans, if you know France, in the Loire Valley. It's a very beautiful 11th century basilica. It's a pilgrimage site. And Jacob was not a monk, but he was a lay associate, and he lived in deep devotion there for a 7-year period ending in 1928, and then again from death in 1944, his death when he was arrested by the Gestapo as a Jew and sent to the transit camp of Drancy, from which 86,000 Jews were sent to Auschwitz mainly, but to some other extermination camps. Jacob's sister and brother-in-law had already died there in the gas chambers. He was slated to be on the next transport in March 1944, but you might say he had the luck to die of pneumonia in the camp the day before his transport. So the French now consider him the French tag is mort pour la France, dead for France, kind of martyr, the martyr poet. So he didn't consider himself a martyr. And I'll read you one of his poems just to give you a feeling for why did I bother to spend my life, most of my adult life, tracking down this guy and talking to a lot of people who knew him, and they're all dead now, obviously. Because I started this in 1985 on a Guggenheim. So here's a poem. I just hope to give you a feeling for his prose. His prose poems have been translated by John Ashbery and Bill Zavatsky and all sorts of people. You can find Jacob's prose poems in English. It's harder to find his lyric poems. So here's one of the lyrics, which expresses a lot of his poetry is queer coded, a lot of gender bending love poems. And so I hope that's what you'll hear in this. Handsome knights of Alcantara, Venus of Marne la Coquette, the Nabob of Calatrava offers you his private yacht to sail away to Guatemala. When I had renounced your love, O women, when I had of pleasure intoned the requiem and conquered Bethlehem, when I had cast off the henbane of this world and of the wandering Jew's eternal voyage the sail unfurled, when beneath the cramped balcony the vice squad and its looking gaze at my door to enroll me in its militias, I had made my room a secret oasis or almshouse. I did not yet know the clear sky of your eyes, the snowy kingdom of your limbs in summer, nor the perfumed hell in your thick hair, nor your beauty, which will be my holy grail, nor your soul, for which I shall be Parsifal. Handsome knights of Alcantara, handsome knights of Alcantara, all aboard, anchors away. Let them rush off to the tropics. I have only one mystic exodus, one reliquary and its relic. I have one tender oasis only, you, your eyes, their forget-me-not blue. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosanna. It's such a marvelous book. It's such an exploration of a life and a life of poetry, and to show how poetry gave life to the person, and vice versa. It's just a remarkable, remarkable book. My biography is H.G. Adler, A Life in Many Worlds, which was published by Oxford in 2019. I came to it to the biography actually as a translator. In the first decade of roughly 2001 to 2014, I translated 3 novels by H.G. Adler. The first one that came out was called The Journey, then Panorama, and then The Wall. I stumbled on The Journey in Schoenhoff's foreign language bookstore in Harvard Yard. It no longer exists, unfortunately, a great, great loss. And I had spent many years translating Ingeborg Bachmann, and was kind of searching around for a translation project, and was going through the fiction shelves at Schoenhoff's and pulled down Eine Reise by H.G. Adler. I did not know who he was. Read 2 pages in the bookstore and knew immediately that I had to translate it. I didn't know who he was. It was a very handsome reissue of the novel, I thought, and he was basically a Holocaust survivor. I thought this would be easy to find. The prose was so powerful. I would describe it as the Holocaust written by Virginia Woolf or William Faulkner, a kind of very modernist, multi-levered, multi-valenced handling of the story. And it took me 8 years and 40 publishers to find a publisher. And finally, it was actually Random House that published the novels, and they received quite good attention. And I went on to do Panorama. And then finally, my editor said, well, if you want to get Adler better known, you should write a biography of him. 2010 was his centenary, and I was invited to speak at it at the Deutsches Literaturarchiv in Marbach, Germany, where Adler's archive is. And I went 2 days early and rushed through the archive, which consists of 320 boxes of roughly 3 foot by 2 foot, filled with 10 to 12 files of letters, unpublished short stories, unpublished poems at that time, unpublished novels. There are actually 4 unpublished novels still waiting to see light of day. And thank God, all of it, 97, 98% of it was typed. Adler was born left-handed and was very common in the time, was trained not to write with his left hand. His handwriting was so bad, his own family members couldn't read it when he was a child writing home to them. So even in his teens, he began to type everything that he ever wrote. And that said that at least logistically, I could write a biography, and I just went for it. H.G. Adler, born in 1910 to a secularized Jewish German-speaking family in Prague, Czechoslovakia. Prague at that time is the Prague of Kafka. Adler's father went to school with Kafka, and Adler himself sat on a school bench with a cousin, a nephew of Kafka. Himself never met Kafka, and actually, I'll get that in a moment. He aspires to become a writer himself, goes to university, studies musicology, has a very unhappy childhood. His mother was bipolar, and of course, in those days, the diagnosis and treatments were very crude. She ends up being institutionalized when he is age 10 for the rest of her life. He is shipped off to foster homes and to a Freemasons Institute boarding school in Dresden, Germany, which he later called his first concentration camp. He was badly bullied as a Jew and as a Czech and as a German-speaking Czech, and the nationalities were in great conflict with one another. His father was a kind man, but really didn't know how to raise him. His father ran a print shop and stationery store in Prague and threw all of his energy into that. So that's why Adler was sent off to foster schools for 5 years. He comes back to Prague at age 15. And really that experience, if there was anyone ready to survive a concentration camp, it was H.G. Adler. H.G. stands for Hans Gunther. And because Eichmann's henchman in charge of deportations from Prague was named Hans Gunther, and later on Gunther Adler refused to ever use it as a writer. He was known to his friends and family as Gunther, but officially as a writer, he was always H.G. Adler for his entire life. Goes to university, aspires to be a writer and a novelist, but of course things begin to go sour in the 1930s in Prague, and in 1941 is deported to Theresienstadt, where he spends 32 months with his first wife, Gertrude Klepetar, her mother, and her father. The father dies in Theresienstadt, and Adler himself says to himself, if I survive this experience, and most likely I will not, I will capture it in two ways, in both scholarship and in writing. And by that, he meant creative writing, novels, poetry, short stories. And that is exactly what he proceeded to do. He worked as a bricklayer in the camp. He refused to work for the Jewish administration because he saw them as doing the Nazis' bidding and basically unwittingly being cohorts of what the Nazis wanted to have happen. And of course, that was the deportations to the east. Theresienstadt was the primary point for deportations to Auschwitz and all of the eastern death camps. So Adler works as a bricklayer, but also writes. He writes 108 poems in Theresienstadt, begins a novel, writes several short stories, wrote lectures that were given in Theresienstadt, gives a lecture on Franz Kafka's 60th birthday, with Ottilie Kafka, Kafka's favorite sister, in the audience in Theresienstadt. And it is likely the only lecture given on Franz Kafka in the German-speaking countries of the time, because, of course, it would have put one in grave danger. Kafka was a banned author, so he was not to be discussed. Ottilie Kafka came up to Adler afterwards and said, on behalf of the family, I thank you. The lecture was such a success, it was repeated 2 days later at another location in Theresienstadt. Adler and his wife, Gertrude Klepetar, are there for 32 months. October 1944, they and Gertrude's mother are deported to Auschwitz. When they get to Auschwitz, the mother is selected out. Gertrude could not bear the fact of leaving her mother, and so she stays with her, and they both are taken to the gas chamber immediately. Adler himself is in Auschwitz for 2 weeks, the two most miserable weeks of his entire camp experience. And then he's transferred to a small labor camp, Niederroschel, and for 4 months, and then for another 4 months, the last camp, Langenstein, where he another 3 weeks, and he would have died. It was liberated by the Americans in May 1945. It takes him 6 weeks to get back to Prague, where he finds out that 18 of his family members have perished in the camps during the time. He then tries to contact a high school friend who he had urged to go to England for her own safety, and her name was Bettina Gross. She was an artist and sculptor herself. She spent the war working in a button factory, doing graphic design in South Wales. He finds her address, she finds his, that she finds out that he's alive in Prague. They don't know that, and their letters to one another cross. Their first letters cross in the mail from South Wales to Prague, and from Prague to South Wales. Within 6 weeks, by mail, Adler proposes marriage to Bettina. In fact, he doesn't even propose. He simply writes to her and says, now that we will be married. And Bettina writes back and says, Gunther, what have you done? You haven't even asked me. And then accepts the proposal. They had not seen each other for 7 years. There are literally hundreds of letters between them for the next 2 years, because it takes that long till 1947 for him to get a visa. And they write to each other at least once, if not twice, sometimes 3 times a day. He gets out in 47 to London, and then begins to start work on his Theresienstadt book. I should go back, as he wanted to capture experience in two ways: creative writing, I covered that; scholarship, he gathered notes in Theresienstadt. Gertrude was the head of the laboratory in Theresienstadt, so she had access to all the administrative documents passing from the Jewish Council and the Nazi leadership. He tucks them away in a attaché case. When he's deported to Auschwitz, he leaves the attaché case with Leo Beck, the head of German Jewry, who was in prison in Theresienstadt, goes back to Theresienstadt after the liberation and the end of the war, collects the bag, and basically walks out of Theresienstadt in July of 1945 with the next 40 years of his life. The notes that would make the Theresienstadt monograph 1,000 pages. It's really one of the first Holocaust study books that we have. The beginnings of the novels and the stories and the poetry that would make his reputation. Having said all of this, Adler remained entirely unknown. People might be familiar with him in the climax of W.G. Sebald's Austerlitz. Austerlitz wants to know more about Theresienstadt, and there's a famous 10-page sentence by Sebald, which basically talks about Adler and the Theresienstadt book. It's Sebald's homage to Adler himself. I will end just by reading a poem of Adler's from 1945 after he's returned from Prague. This is just 6 weeks, not even that, it's actually only a couple of weeks after he's returned, and it's simply called Nothing. At last it is behind us, and yet what has happened? Nothing. The ugly sickness seeps through the blood. Nothing has happened, nothing. Evil's black spawn forfeits only time, and time can surely just pass by. Otherwise, nothing. There remains the tide of darkness washing thick and heavy in the depths, and what we see is unredeemed and stands like an obscure question. Nothing has happened. Alas, nothing. Yet always courage is greater than misery, and will not just pass by. Our ship runs aground on misery. How are we to endure when we are so lonely in the furnace of our hearts, when we are bereft of any benign protection and know nothing? Nothing, and nothing is our realm, and nothing even comes close to atonement. I think what we hear already in the early days in Adler is the feeling of being neglected, mistreated, both by, of course, the Nazis, but also history. He would go on to write 26 books of fiction, poetry, social science, philosophy, religion, but remained completely unknown. The books were published by very minor presses, except for the Theresienstadt book, which he gained some fame for. Stumbling on him in 2001 was a retrieval that I didn't even know I was making, and it would take me to 2019 to complete that retrieval by writing the biography. Thanks very much, and we'd be happy to take questions from people.
Thank you both so much. This has been a wonderful reading of poetry and fascinating biographies of these wonderful artists. I've got a question to kick things off. There's already a great comment in the chat or question there. But first of all, first question for both of you is, why in this country do we have such a bad reputation at reading stuff in translation, while in other countries they're familiar, more internationally with what's going on?
Whoa,
yeah,
that's a complicated question. What do you think, Peter?
I talk about this with my students. I teach translation at Bard, and I think it is a desire for authenticity, for the authentic product, and therefore some skewed view that a translation is not the authentic product. It took a long time in this country to get the names of translators even onto the title page of translations. If you look at the novels of Heinrich Böll, translated in the 1970s, you will not find the names of the translators on those books. They didn't exist. So we tend not to understand translation as a literary, writerly, artful act. I think that's changing. I think it's getting better. Fantastic presses like Archipelago books do bring out marvelous translations. You do see translators' names on books. Translation prizes exist. Translators are celebrated. It's better, but you're right. There's still an impediment. Only less than 3% of the books published in America are translations. In Germany or Spain or Italy, roughly 40% are translations.
Yeah. We might think of it as a kind of almost semi-conscious imperialism.
Yeah.
That if we're the empire, what do we need anybody else for?
Yeah.
We are the empire. Other people want our books. Why should we look at their books, those piddly little countries? I mean, I'm exaggerating, but I think there's a little something of that. But luckily, we're not going to be an empire much longer. We probably aren't even now. Soon we'll be Sweden if we're lucky.
Yeah. Sweden would be nice.
Well, they were an empire in the 17th century.
Yeah,
They were a rampaging big empire. I know you know.
Thanks so much, both of you. It is getting better. That is definitely true. But I just, as a note before we get into Jonathan's great question here, I have noticed, just as a curiosity, a lot of mystery novels that have translated. You don't know that when you see them at first on the covers. The ones that are coming out now, still it's still there. I've seen as a king. But there's a great question here, as I said, from Jonathan in the chat. Jonathan Blank, he says, for Miss Warren, as a biographer of the poet James Wright, who revered Jacob, who's been really impressed and grateful for your focus on Jacob's marvelous intelligence about poems, and your book is full of smart and useful maxims or maxisms about poetry. He loves that. Could you talk a little bit more about these maxims of Jacob's and maybe what influence he's had what influence he has had in this country?
Thank you so much for that wonderful, appreciative question. And James Wright has a lovely poem, of course, about Max Jacob at Saint-Benoît, and he is a very was in deep sympathy with Jacob. That's wonderful. Jacob was a natural pedagogue. He loved talking to young people about, and not even so young people, about how to write poetry. And one of his untranslated books, which I hope someone will translate someday, is called Art Poétique, and it's just full of his aphorisms and advice and some of the writers he influenced, you will all know. The poet, the Jewish Alexandrian poet Edmond Jabès was basically a student, went to school with, in a sense, getting advice from Jacob, who was older. And that's a beautiful correspondence that Jabès published after Jacob's death. Michel Léris was a fantastically interesting French ethnographer, autobiographer, just did hundreds of letters from Jacob to Léris advising him when Léris was a young writer trying to figure out how to do things. Maybe if I can find the maxims, the French has a penchant for maxims and aphorisms as a mode. You could think back to the 17th century, La Rochefoucauld, for instance. I guess this book is 700 pages, and I can't immediately put my finger on some of his maxims, but he was constantly advising Jabès, for instance, young Edmond Jabès, to be concrete, to look at the concrete image. And he was advising the younger writers to love words and to love dictionaries. And he was advising them to imitate. And Jacob himself was an incredible mynah bird. People have described how he could walk down the street reciting fake Victor Hugo. He could make up Victor Hugo by the ream and the Alexandrines and the rhymes and all that. So he was advising young writers to imitate and then recreate. So those are a few of the maxims of Max Jacob, and there are I mean, I talked to Jabez. As I said, when I went in 1985 to France and spent a long time there doing the first research of many, many decades of research, Jabez was one of the people I talked to, and he was very moving about his apprenticeship with Jacob. And he, for instance, here's a creative writing story for you. When Jabez was this young, ambitious, brash, young Egyptian Jew, and he sent his manuscript of poems that he, Jabez, thought were brilliant to the famous Max Jacob, and then met Jacob, I think it was in Paris at the time, and they sat down together, and he was expecting to be praised. And Jacob picked up the whole manuscript and dropped it in the wastepaper basket, and turned to the young man and said, "Now we can begin."
That's fantastic.
I don't think you'd be allowed to do that in a
I was
creative.
going to say
writing
there are days now and then I wish, but I wouldn't dare.
It wasn't so great for the self-esteem, but it was good for the poetry.
There's another question here from Jennifer. She says, this is for both of you, and I'm curious about this too. What sustains each of you during these long-term projects that take many, many years? How can you possibly keep going on something that takes this long?
Yeah, I mean, Rosanna's is much longer than mine. I spent, probably 10, 12 years doing the translations, and it was about 8 years researching and writing the biography. What I can say, it was just the power of the story itself, and having so much wonderful material to work with. Adler wrote 10 to 15 pages of letters per day for 40 years, to editors, to friends, to writers. He spent a lot of time going back to Germany to do further research on the Holocaust, which meant he was away from Bettina, his wife, for months at a time, and therefore was writing her every day. So I got the, if you will, the pillow talk, which biographers generally don't get. And he would, say which writers he detested or what had happened in, the newspaper that day, or how well his work was going, or mostly how badly it was going. Anything. I just had so much wonderful material. And then the fact that he was so unknown and so courageous as a novelist. He was really a very modernist, avant-garde, way ahead of his time as a novelist, and so ambitious. His collected poems come to 1,200 pages. I mean, he just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. And to have that much material, and the feeling that I had the responsibility to bring his life to the world, was just extremely compelling.
Yeah, what would I say about what sustained me? Well, I often wondered who was going to die first, if Max was going to die first or I was going to die first. And I often thought that I would. I outlived him. But I think one thing that, well, I don't know, maybe a kind of mania sustained me, and obsession. And often people would say, why are you obsessed with a homosexual Jewish French guy? Because you're not French or homosexual or a man or Jewish. And I had no good answer for that, except I somehow felt that he'd entered my life in such a deep way that I had no choice. In fact, I will tell you, I never meant to write this biography. I was translating his poems when I was in my 20s, and I was translating them because they took me over. They really possessed me. It was like a demon who said to me one day, well, why don't you write this biography? And I remember telling her, well, I would never write a biography. I was a real little snot. I said, I would never write a biography. It's a low mimetic mode, I said. And then 5 minutes later, after I'd hung up the phone, I realized that Max Jacob had already taken over my entire life, redirected my life, and of course I would write his life. So then started all kinds of ordeals. But one thing that kept me going, I think, was that I began to see that each chapter, I wanted to write it as a short story in itself, craft each chapter so it had an arc, a narrative arc, some kind of tension. And that gave me at least a satisfaction chapter by chapter that I had written something. And I published a few of the chapters along the way so I could look at it in print and I could say, I'm not completely delusional, maybe just 75% delusional.
Yeah, I would add to that, the same happened for me, that very early on, I actually have a little note, just a little 4x5 notepad page where I wrote out the chapter titles while having a glass of wine in Marbach, where the archive was, on a summer evening. And though the titles changed a little bit, I had the basic structure of the book. And therefore, I was able to write the book a chapter at a time. Each chapter came in at about 10,000 words in rough draft. So I would write one chapter, which allowed me to do the final research for the next chapter. So, or I could write a chapter, in a semester break, or write 3 chapters over the summer. So it was easy to begin and have a place to stop and then move on to the next segment. That was really an important element.
Thank you. We have a question here from Claire as well. She's asking Peter if you could go into a little bit more detail about the Adler's scholarship and what you meant when he made his vow. What did scholarship at the time? How was it defined? And what does it mean by recording it?
Yeah, he was a freelance scholar. The Theresienstadt book is called Theresienstadt 1941 to 1945, The Face of a Coerced Community. It was translated a few years ago, came out from Cambridge University Press, not by me, by Belinda Cooper, did a wonderful job with it. And it's full, it is a soup to nuts encyclopedia of how Theresienstadt ran and what happened in it. If you want to know the calorie count from potatoes that children took in Theresienstadt, you'll find it in that book. If you want to know the number of typhus cases that were recorded in Theresienstadt, you'll find it in that book. You'll find the history of Theresienstadt as a town, a garrison town, even before it was founded. You'll find administrative documents from the Nazis. It's 1,000 pages long. If you wanted to set up a place called Theresienstadt, one of the most miserable camps of all, this would tell you exactly how to do it and how to run it. What you will not find in there is Adler's own experience. There's a little extended note at the beginning of the notes at the back of the book where he gives a quick rundown of when he was deported to Theresienstadt, left, when he went to Auschwitz, what happened to Gertrude. But that's it. It is not a memoir. It is a collection of the raw facts on the ground, which started, as I say, from these notes that he tucked away into this black briefcase that we still have. It's in the archive, actually, and that he walked out with. So it is extremely comprehensive view of Theresienstadt. And as I say, was one of the first Holocaust studies books, even before we had something called Holocaust studies that didn't even exist.
Peter, am I correct in remembering that his book was used in the trials in Israel? Wasn't Adler asked to be a witness in some of the Nazi trials in Israel?
He was asked to write an affidavit, and he writes a 47-page affidavit to show that Eichmann knew what he was doing. And in fact, you write, thanks for reminding me of that, Rosanna, Eichmann read Adler's Theresienstadt book in his cell in Jerusalem in order to brush up on what he had done. It was the most authoritative document at the time, and it was used by the prosecution in the trial itself. Hannah Arendt was very aware of it. She tried to help to get it published in English even before it was published in German, and she really kind of raided it in her Eichmann in Jerusalem book, and Adler became very bitter about Arendt doing that, felt that she had not given him enough credit. Because of his marginalized career, he became a fairly bitter man by the end of it. He felt he had been so neglected by publishers. Now, part of that, the reason for that is he's in England, He's not in Germany or Austria or even Czechoslovakia. He's on the margin of the literary world. He also was an extremely proud and stubborn man. He would not market his experience. He didn't want to cheapen it. He was devoted to remembering the lost and rendering them, as I said, in both artful novels, extremely artful novels, poetry, and his scholarship. He goes on to write a 1,200-page book called Der Verwaltete Mensch, Administered Man, which is a book on the entire deportation system. And it too is full of very minute kinds of facts, but also a long philosophical essay about administration, bureaucracy being the bane of modern existence. When you turn, and this goes to our current crisis, Rosanna, when you turn people into objects and begin to ship them around and jail them and deport them, and all we need to do is think of the border crisis and under Trump, and so many times I would scream at the television at night saying, "That's Adler, what's going on there?" I mean, he would have just rolled in his grave seeing that kind of treatment.
Well, I'm sorry to say that we're out of time. This has been a fascinating and really enjoyable and terrifying also event and evening. And thank you both so much. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
I see
all.
friends here, and it's
Thank
so nice
you.
to see you all. Thank you, Rosanna. It's a delight to read with you. Thank you, David and Rachel, for helping us out.
Thanks to all.
Oh, sorry.
And hooray for independent bookstores.
Yes.
Please stay.
And please,
You're the lighthouse.
And please support them, as I know everyone would here. I see friends, Elaine, Jenny, Stanley. It's so nice to see many of you here. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
So forth, and H.G. Adler and Water Music and Max Jacob, all available at northshire.com. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Bye.